But what I'm going to do, instead of reading it a second time, is I'm going to give you my nutshell version of the story that was read earlier. Because Jesus compared the ways of God to a vineyard owner that went and hired folks to come and work his field, and went in early and was able to gather folks to work it, and then there was still work to be done, so he went out another time and he grabbed more, and even later into the day he grabbed a last group of folk. Now, the thing about Jesus is his stories is there's always a reason that he's telling it. And he typically has a wow ending or something that just turns the tables a little bit. And so as he hired that first wave of workers, he promised them a fair daily wage. And as he hired the second wave and then eventually hired the third wave, anybody hearing that story back then, and I would even anticipate now, any of us that hear that story up to that point, our natural expectation and inclination is certainly those that have been working longer will get paid more. And so where he turns the story on its head is when he calls the very last people that he encountered in for payment and gives them the fair daily wage, even though they had only worked a very short period of time. And then when he called in, and then called in even those that had been there with him from the very beginning, certainly they thought, as you would, well, I'm not going to presume, as I think many of you would think, as I certainly would have thought, that's great. That means I'm going to get even more. And so, that's not how Jesus then compares God to the vineyard owner. Because the vineyard owner turns around and gives the very earliest workers the same exact wage as those that he called towards the end of the day. I'm getting to know what some of you do for a living or have done for a living, and I know we have folks in here that have business backgrounds and even business degrees, and truth be told, I even started as a business major before I made my way into, what did you call? Yeah. Nowhere in any of the classes that I took did they ever say it's going to be great business practice to pay those that do the least amount of work the exact same wage as those that have been working their tails off much longer. I've not seen that in any business textbook. If you have and you have a business background, also see me during coffee fellowship. This is also one of these stories that folks outside of our faith want to point to and say those socialist kind of people. Except that the story is not about economics, at least not fiscal economics. The story is about the economy of God's grace and God's love. And whether you have known God's grace and God's love your entire life, or whether you've just recently come to experience it, it's an equal footing across the board. As Jesus was telling this story to very early followers, and again, he compared it to the kingdom of God in God's ways, there was already infighting going on about whether someone, if they hadn't been totally faithful to the Jewish tradition, newcomers to the faith certainly could not be on equal footing as those whose generations had been faithful to God's calling and God's way. God would still love them. There would still be grace for them, but certainly not to the same extent. As I do transitional ministry with churches, I would love to say that that parable no longer really is all that applicable. Well, God's grace and God's love for absolutely everybody on an equal footing is applicable today as it was back then. I'd love to say that it's not applicable that we don't see things as early folk did. But I've got to tell you, when I've come into churches, and I'm not going to say this one because I've had a number of churches that I've served doing what I do. And Gail and I still try to figure out what that's called and what pastors do. It still surprises me, I guess, that sometimes people go, my family has been here from the very beginning. They only started coming a little while ago. And sometimes I hear that and I think, well, they've been coming a couple weeks, they've been coming a couple months. No, when they say they've been coming a couple while ago, 10, 12, 15 years. When my family and I moved to southern Tuscarawas County, I loved the people down here. And if any of you are watching this sermon clip, I love you still. But that community down there had an ethos of, if you had not been generation upon generation upon generation, in fact, if your family had not been one that had settled in that community, you were still an outsider. I knew pastors that had served for 3 decades in the same community, and they were still seen as the new kids on the block. It's human nature, I think, for us to say, if you've been around longer, if you've given more, then certainly you must have a little bit more footing, a little bit more something. Jesus continues to turn things on its head. The economy of grace and love is, whether you have been from the beginning or whether you are recent in, you are equally loved, you are equally affirmed, your voice is equally heard. That's the beauty of our faith. To take us back to that biblical story that we heard, and where we might be able to draw some similarities to today. Perhaps there's a reason why the first batch of folks were called into the vineyard. Perhaps they were the most physically able. Perhaps they were the younger. Perhaps they were the most fit. And if you want to draw that story out, perhaps there was a reason why, even as the vineyard owner came to the very end of the day, perhaps those that were called in that story were because they weren't as physically fit. I'm speculating at this point. Don't go do research on this. But we also do sort of a similar thing. We reach out for those that we think fit the context the most and grab them first. And then if we need more folks, we may go grab a few more. And then if we're really desperate, perhaps we'll go and grab the very last of who's left. Let me clean this up a little bit, because that's not what I'm saying how God operates. I'm saying that's how we have a tendency to operate. What does it look like, church? What does it look like when we sing about God's grace and God's love for all? That we truly live into being that. What does it look like when we say, we don't care if you've just moved into Twinsburg or whether you are a founding family within this wonderful community, you are welcomed here. You matter here. You are needed here. We have so many ministries to tackle. Next Sunday, we begin a step out in faith of providing a community meal that some of you have been talking about wanting to do for a number of years now. When I come into churches and do what I do, normally the first question I ask is, well, then why aren't you doing it? And sometimes the answers will vary. I normally have not found really good, solid answers for not stepping out and doing it. So I gain a reputation of being a troublemaker. It's a well-deserved reputation. Because I simply say, no more reasons why we're not going to. If it's a ministry, if it's a mission that's going to touch and help people, if it is a ministry and a mission that says no matter who you are and where you are on life's journey, you are welcomed, you are accepted, you are loved, and you are affirmed right here, then we're going to find a way to do it. And we're going to count on the folks that have been here from the very inception of this. None of you have been here from the inception of this church. We're going on our 200th year anniversary. And I'm intentionally keeping my eyes closed so nobody thinks I'm looking at anybody right now. Whether you have been in this church your entire life, whether you have just recently started coming here or coming back here, you are needed. You are valued. You are loved. You are God's. May we continually come together and remind each other of that.